Welcome to Q&A episode 3 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. I have with me today both Zach and Jake. This is Jake's first showing on the podcast. So Jake, if you want to say what's up and let the listeners know your voice so they're not super confused when you start answering questions.
What's up, everybody? It's good to be here.
All right, and then really quick before we get to our questions, we honestly have no idea whether people are actually listening to this podcast. We have it on YouTube, which looks like people are checking it out, but we presume that people would prefer to listen to podcasts on something like Apple Podcasts. But none of us here have any idea how to see how many downloads there have been on Apple Podcasts, how many listens there have been. So we honestly have no idea. So in order to ensure that we invest in this podcast, that we continue to do it, go ahead and drop a 5-star review. Leave, I guess that's a rating, leave a review as well. That will incentivize us to pay the massive fee to keep our podcast up for longer than 30 days. So if you don't do this, we are going to, you're only going to have access to these podcasts for about 30 days. So again, drop a rating and review. And the last thing I'll say is thank you to everybody that submitted questions, both we have a bunch from our clients. We also have questions from non-clients. So thank you everybody that submitted questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them today, but there's a chance we'll be able to get to your question in a later episode because we kind of have them banked up. So yeah, we have a few questions lined up today, and we'll go ahead with our first question from our friend Josh Gibson, and he asks, what's your favorite caffeinated beverage?
I'll go ahead and kick this one off. Like I said on the 8th take that we've done here, I have a pretty strong opinion on this one. I'm a coffee person, and I just want to say that all these energy drinks that people put on their stories and all that stuff is just battery acid, and I just don't care. It doesn't taste good, just not a fan. So you guys can have fun with your energy drinks and the rat poison, and I'll just stick to my black coffee and drink that, and that's pretty much all I need. So Jake, what do you got?
Well, it's a little confusing because I was pretty sure that you were a Bang energy drink model now. But
have you seen what I look like? Have you seen what I look like?
It's a good look.
I don't know if I fit those classifications.
We're hitting a different demographic. For me, I'm a coffee person as well, just as black, dark roast as you can get, or pumpkin spice latte to satisfy my basic white girl inside of me. And that's my preference. That's about it.
Yeah, you can tell we're all master's students, and the fact that we only like coffee. I mean, my aversion to energy drinks or battery acid, per Zach's description, is just that why would you pay that amount of money for caffeine? It's like what, $2-3 for one of those energy drinks. It's like a cup of coffee is what, like a dime when you add it all up. So just from a utilitarian standpoint, coffee is the way to go, and then you learn to like it from there. You don't pursue what you like. You learn to like what makes sense from a utilitarian standpoint.
Water and caffeine pills is a close second.
Indeed. All right. With that, I'll go ahead and throw out question number 2. This is from James Walsham of the Hypertrophy Hub podcast. He asks, what proactive aspects do you use in programming, and how do you balance that with the reactive elements?
So that's a really good question. James, thanks for taking the time to enter that question. I think that kind of the essence of this question comes down to the fact that there are proactive and reactive elements. I think that's the first kind of thing to say there, is that there are both. They're not mutually exclusive. You can't just do one and not the other. I think for the most part, I think the setup that we use is kind of a proactive element, and then maybe some of the finer details and the tweaking of those kind of that skeleton is what becomes a reactive process. So some of the first couple things that come to my mind as far as proactive elements in programming would be intro weeks, for example. That's something we're going to proactively do to try to manage a workload to make sure that we can get to the peak volume without doing that too fast. Also, just the grander scheme of periodization, I think, is also kind of a proactive thing, that within that there are reactive elements to determine phase length, block length, manipulations and exercise selection, all that good stuff. But the overarching kind of concept is a proactive one, in the sense that we're trying to potentiate one type of training with another type of training. Those are the kind of the top two that come off of my head. I don't know, Josh, if you have anything kind of want to add there. I know we were talking about a little bit of this earlier.
Yeah, so I would second everything Zach said. But I guess my head, when I read this question, kind of goes towards some things that we can take away from exercise science and just the body of knowledge that we have that is separate from athlete training data that can indicate how we should program. So these are the basic check marks. This is the basic checklist we should all be working towards, right? If you're trying to maximize your rate of muscle mass accumulation, you should be checking off things like taking the muscle of interest through a long range of motion, doing so in a movement pattern that you can progressively overload, perhaps being in or ensuring that you're in a calorie surplus. So to me, I don't think these are mutually exclusive, and I don't think anybody would argue that they are mutually exclusive. I think you have to kind of start with these basic principles of programming, of training, of exercise science, right, to give you the overall framework. And then you also have these bottom up or these reactive aspects that can kind of fill in the details, right? Do pin squats make more sense than pause squats this block? When we did X variation, did we see Y result? So I think, again, they're mutually exclusive, but I guess the proactive aspects, or I guess I would just make the argument that it's impossible to be fully reactive, in the sense that you have to have a starting point. You have to have some framework of knowledge and some framework of checklists to accomplish the goal of the particular training phase. So Jake, if you have anything to add, we feel free to jump in. If not, you can throw the next question at us. Your call, man.
Yeah, I think just to kind of put a bow on it, I would just say a really easy way to think about that is like the proactive elements that you guys outlined gets us in the ballpark, gets us kind of to the spot we're aiming for, and then the reactive is just managing and auto-regulating and making small adjustments within that. So, all right, so next question would be, what were y'all's motivation to pursue graduate schooling in exercise science? Additionally, what do you think those who are thinking about pursuing a graduate program in exercise science should look for in a program, school, supervisor? What should they consider generally before pulling the trigger? That kind of stuff.
Go for it, Zach. You're further along in our program.
Oh man. Okay, so I'm the old gray guy here, huh? So yeah, this is a really good question. I think as far as I think collectively our motivations to pursue grad school are probably going to be similar among many disciplines, and it's simply the areas that you find yourself drawn to, you have questions, and the current state of your education doesn't allow you to have sufficient answers to those questions. So you continue to pursue education to find answers to those questions, which inevitably, if you're kind of in our shoes, you find that there's more questions that you ask yourself, and that kind of rabbit hole never really ends. But I think that's kind of the motivation to pursue higher education in general, is that you have this desire for knowledge and desire to understand things at a higher level. Because likely in our field, for the most part, you come to a crossroads in practice to what to do. You find yourselves in a situation where you don't know exactly the practical way to apply the ideas that you do have, and so you want to have additional education to equip yourself with more tools to solve those problems in practice. So I think just to kind of wrap that up, I think the motivation for grad school in general is just to seek answers to questions that you have. And that's generally what it is for me, to understand that stuff on a higher level. As far as if someone was pursuing grad school, kind of the advice for a program school supervisor and all that good stuff, I think the first thing would be to consider what level of education you're at. The higher you go in grad school, probably the more dependent. My advice to that person would be on the advisor. Especially if you're getting up to the levels of PhD and really high level of education, in which
your education is almost directly for that person, essentially. The more your dependency on that person and how they treat you and your guys' relationship, and just making sure that you're cohesive in all those regards, I think is more important. The farther you go down the ladder, as far as undergrad, masters, that kind of stuff, I think I would more shift my advice to the program and equipping you with the baseline underlying knowledge to be able to apply higher level ideas as you kind of go through the education spectrum. So for undergrad, maybe that's a program that has a solid understanding of the principles, the physiology, the anatomy, all that good stuff that allows you to, once you get into applying that baseline knowledge into whatever field you really want to delve deep into, you'll have the foundations covered so that you can really not miss any blind spots as far as that stuff is considered when you're really trying to go deep into one specific area, if that's what you're interested in. But that was kind of my long-winded answer. I definitely took that from a research point of view, just because that's what we're all kind of interested in. So if you guys want to dovetail off that with maybe a different perspective, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll hop in and start off with the first part of that question, which is, what were my personal motivations to pursue graduate schooling in exercise science? I started off my undergraduate degree actually in an engineering program, just because I thought it would be better, financially, social perception of your major, that kind of stuff, which I quickly learned was a silly reason to pursue a career path. And it took me about 2 weeks of college to change my mind. And I knew I was really interested in lifting weights. And I think a lot of us kind of get into it for personal reasons. I don't know if I would describe them as selfish reasons, but we get into it because we want to get big and jacked. And I was like, oh, and then I became a pre-physical therapy student. And, this is a nice mix of being able to, think about muscles and lifting weights and some principles of strength and conditioning apply, but it also looks good in terms of social perception. So it's like, oh, this is a good balance. And then, I stumbled upon a professor in my undergraduate degree who was looking for research assistants, and that, without getting into the details of the work he was doing and the work that I helped out with, so to kind of summarize what that professor was doing, he was implementing some resistance training and behavioral programs into special populations. And I was like, oh, this lifting weight stuff can actually help people. And you can also, finding the most efficient way to accrue muscle mass, finding the most efficient way to improve an individual's strength can have actual clinical applications. So just my experience of working in that laboratory, kind of, I would start to echo some of Zach's stuff about just kind of pushing the boundary of our knowledge of how to do this, of how to apply some of this stuff. So in order to get to that boundary, you have to take multiple steps along the way, right? So you kind of start in the center of the circle of undergraduate training, and then with a master's program, you expand a little bit, and then PhD, you expand a little bit more, and now you're by definition at the outer banks of human knowledge, and then you can start pushing the knowledge beyond there. So I just think that drive to kind of push the field forward is what gets me excited about this stuff. So again, that was kind of my long-winded motivations for pursuing graduate school. And then the next part of the question is, what things you should think about when pursuing a graduate program in exercise science. So I think the things you should be looking for change a little bit when you get to grad school as opposed to undergraduate. And I would just echo what Zach said about thinking more about the advisor as opposed to the program itself or the school itself. Because that's in ensuring that they're a good person and they're going to be a good mentor. And secondly, that their research is of interest to you. That's not to say that if you do a master's degree in exercise science that you have to become a researcher, but you're probably going to spend a good amount of time helping with their research. So, those would be the two biggest take homes in terms of looking for a program is think about the advisor and the research they're doing, because that's what you're going to be helping out with.
I'll add just a couple quick things. I completely agree. I don't really have anything to add in terms of looking for programs and advisors and all that. I think you guys did a great job. In terms of motivation, I think there's a couple other things that were there for me personally, and I'm sure that you guys can relate. One would be just the desire to understand research better from a coaching perspective, because obviously that's a big part of what we do, but I think that's a big part of what almost all good coaches do, right? Is at least being able to understand what's going on with the research. And you know, it's not that research tells us exactly what to do, but just having that understanding helps you to apply it appropriately, understand the limitations appropriately, all those sorts of things. So that was a big motivation for me. It's like, you can try to read papers on your own, but without the training that you get, particularly in grad school, it can be really, really difficult. And it's unbelievably easy to miss things or to misinterpret things if you're not trained. So, and I don't say that meaning that I'm an expert at it by any means. I still, you know, make tons of mistakes all the time, but it's part of the process, right? And this is the place where you learn. And I think the second part was the desire to, like Josh, what you said about expanding human knowledge. And to me, some of it is giving back. I think that finding not just lifting, but like evidence-based lifting, to me, like, it changed my life, right? Like it's changed all our lives. This is what we do, right? So to me, it's just like, I'm very grateful for that, and I want to give back in some way. And I think research is a cool way to do that. So that's what I would add there.
Mic drop
Cool.
there. I'll roll us into the next question. Jake, this one will have you kick off for sure. Do you think it's important to program differently depending on if someone is in a caloric deficit, maintenance, or surplus?
Yeah, so I think that first and foremost, the principles all stay the same. So there's not like, you don't have to do anything too special, but it's just being mindful of, in particular, the recovery and the way that you accrue fatigue is different depending on your caloric intake, right? So if you're in a surplus, typically you're going to be able to recover a lot better. If you're in a deficit, typically you're not going to recover from as much. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're monitoring how much volume you're doing. You know, you might want to pay extra attention, especially if you're in a deficit, of how high is your average RPE getting, where we still want to keep, you know, top sets in there. I think is still a really good idea to maintain the skill, maintain strength, maintain muscle mass. Of course, you want to make sure that you have enough, you know, dose of training to maintain all your muscle mass. You may even be able to build a little bit of muscle in a deficit, but I think that's the main consideration, is just being careful of, you know, if you used to do X number of sets when you were gaining weight, all of a sudden you start losing a pound or two per week, you're probably not going to be able to do the exact same amount of sets unless you were kind of underdoing it on, you know, in the surplus phase. But I think the second big consideration is just from a periodization standpoint, looking at, like, if you're in a hypertrophy phase of training, that's probably the best time to be making, I think of it as body composition changes. So in terms of if you're in a deficit, that's probably best suited to the higher volume training of a hypertrophy phase compared to the, I don't know, it's not that our volume is too crazy low in a strength phase, but it's still like, why not do it in the higher, in the higher volume hypertrophy phase? And also it's just a little bit more efficient that way. Whereas maintenance phase is probably really well suited to that strength phase, not just from a muscle maintenance standpoint, but also just from a technique standpoint. I'm sure anybody who has gained a lot of weight, or especially lost a lot of weight, and tried to do a lot of high load stuff, a lot of peaking for a meet, anything like that, you would notice your leverages feel different. Everything just starts to feel different if you lose a significant amount of weight. So that's a big consideration as well.
Yeah, just to hop in here really quick. I totally agree with Jake. I think conceptualizing hypertrophy focused phases as either period as the ideal period to be in a deficit or to be in a surplus is really helpful, right? I don't think when short-term strength is the primary goal, being in a massive surplus or a massive deficit for most individuals is the best way to go. So I think that's a really helpful kind of heuristic is if you're going to be dialing in, you know, a deficit or a surplus, doing so in a hypertrophy focused phase makes a lot of sense. The second thing I'd say is when somebody is at maintenance or in a deficit, that kind of adjusts my go-tos in terms of in terms of program troubleshooting. So if you suspect that an individual might need slightly more training volume to drive the desired adaptation, maybe that's something you hold off for a little bit if they're in a deficit. Maybe you try to turn over other stones. Maybe this is time to change frequency and see if you can get a positive effect out of that. So I think it kind of becomes self-explanatory when you understand that the lower the calorie intake, the less you can probably be aggressive with training volume and training stress in general. And then I think, again, I think it kind of becomes self-explanatory from there. The other thing I'll add, though, is I wouldn't make programming decisions solely on calorie intake, whether you're in a deficit, maintenance, or a surplus. I think perhaps even more important are life stress factors. Of course, it's just, their caloric intake is another input into the decision-making process. It's not an algorithm in the sense that, oh, you're in a surplus, we have to be in a hypertrophy focused phase. There's the individual is in a robot that's just eating X macros every single day. So I just wanted to clarify that there are other considerations, and this is just kind of, our discussion pertains to all things equal and just manipulating the calorie intake. So Zach, if you have any additional thoughts.
I have nothing to add. Good job, folks. We'll roll on to the next one here. This question is from my man Anise. Anise asks, how do you assess the effectiveness of a hypertrophy cycle and/or block?
So I'll jump in here first. I actually kind of use intuition a good amount with hypertrophy focused phases. There's a fine line between having a progress mindset, but on exercises where we are purposefully manipulating the exercise selection, or purposefully manipulating the repetition range, the proximity to failure, to maximize the efficiency of hypertrophy, I don't like to kind of force progress. So if I have an individual doing 225 for 3 sets of 10 on super strict RDLs to the floor, and their load stays constant, but their technique gets better week to week, that's a good sign in and of itself. But it's not something I can totally quantify in terms of looking at the spreadsheet, right? So basically what I'm saying is there aren't any numbers in particular that I'm looking for in order to determine the effectiveness of the hypertrophy cycle. Like, I think people kind of know if they're doing productive hypertrophy training. So like for myself, by the time I finish a hypertrophy focus phase and I've really executed my my RDLs to the floor super well, I can tell my legs feel stronger. Like, you kind of have that feeling that things are growing and good things are happening under the hood, but your top end strength might not have seen that jump yet. So that leads me to my next point, which is daily minimums. So this is just kind of a concept that's hard to define, but I guess it just kind of points towards a number you could hit on any given day of the week in the gym, or perhaps a load that starts to give you a little bit of performance anxiety. If that's raised a little bit, but your estimated 1 rep max isn't jumping up a ton, that can be a good sign in and of itself. So to kind of wrap up here, I would just say use intuition. Does the coach as well as the athlete feel like you're accruing muscle mass? Are signs pointing in the right direction in terms of body weight changes, perhaps circumference measurements, the way clothes are fitting, and then you can also, of course, factor in performance on hypertrophy focused movements, because even though I noted some of the limitations of that is of course useful, especially when you've been using that exercise for multiple training cycles. So Jake, I'll pass over to you if you want to add in at all.
Yeah, I think that last point you made is really valuable, that I just want to kind of highlight a little bit, is looking at your performance, especially across multiple sets of like a hypertrophy movement, quote unquote. Like, if you started the training block, this is also why I think it's really useful to have the same exercises for a while, not forever, of course, but for multiple blocks if possible. That way you can look and say, okay, in week 1 I did X load at X RPE for this many reps, and then the next training cycle are you able to do a little bit more, right? And it may be a very, very small difference, but over multiple blocks, that's going to accrue. And I think that that's also another point, is just it can be really difficult to assess the effectiveness over one block. I think especially with hypertrophy, like sometimes you really got to zoom out. Eric Helms uses an analogy I really like, that he talks about your hypertrophy training is like you're just putting this recipe together and you stick it in the oven, and you just got to kind of wait and see what happens. And then a couple blocks later, you take it out and see, did it turn out good or not? And I think that that's kind of the unfortunate reality sometimes with hypertrophy, is it just kind of, especially for more advanced people, it just kind of takes a while for any of those changes to really manifest, and you got to just be patient more or less, and then use some of those all the subjective things that Josh just outlined are really good. More novice people, like, you're just going to visually be able to see changes, especially if it's been a couple months or whatever. But yeah, I think that's about all I have. Zach, do you have anything else?
I'm just going to run with that analogy a little bit. I haven't heard that, but I really like it. I think just kind of tie together what you and Josh both said. I totally agree with the intuition portion of it. And then I also agree with what you said, Jake, about using the performance to your advantage, but comparing that cycle to cycle. So it's going to be over a much longer time frame. So to me, the answer becomes, using the cake analogy that you just said, what's like that toothpick you stick in the cake to see if it's done from our intuition perspective? Is it the daily minimum? Is it the performance anxiety? Kind of find what seems to be correlative of the success of that kind of hypertrophy cycle. And you can use that to your advantage to kind of gauge, although not without limitations, obviously, to subjectively identify, how are things going. I think Josh nailed home the daily minimum thing, but that has been something I have personally noticed time and time again, that seems to be pretty well correlated with positive results in muscle mass, and then eventually translating the strength gain. Your estimated 1RM, like Josh said, a lot of times maybe is like just slightly hovering over the same point, or maybe even dips a little bit, but with the same load, you feel extremely confident, and that confidence increases, or maybe your velocity, the average velocity is up a little bit. Or maybe like Josh said, the performance anxiety with that load is down considerably. Like, I think all of those things, in addition to just, like Josh said, just kind of knowing when things are going well, I think all those things shouldn't be ignored. And then once you can kind of take a step back after, 12, 16 weeks and say, how'd this go? And then make, small modifications from there, and then be able to kind of compare things over the long term, I think is the recipe for success there, pun intended.
Just to add in one quick thing, you guys pointed out very well that, we should be taking a longer term point of view in terms of assessing progress. So at the end of a hypertrophy block, a 5-week hypertrophy block, you probably don't know how effective it was. That's why I kind of lean on intuition, and I go back to the some of the proactive stuff I was talking about earlier in the podcast. Your best bet is to kind of check your boxes. When I have an athlete in a hypertrophy focus phase, I'll kind of emphasize, yes, you're going to have to get aroused to some degree for your top set, but I don't want you to get so overly amped up so that there's kind of a come down from that, resulting in, poor performance on your hypertrophy focused work that's going to be following that. And that might be at the expense of seeing estimated 1RM being drived up. And thus you might be like, oh, the hypertrophy block wasn't super productive, which is not how I would approach it. So I would just echo that over the course of 5 weeks, I wouldn't try to determine whether it was effective or not. I think you have to kind of, again, like you guys were saying, let the cake bake and see what happens at the end of the training cycle. Once you go through a proper strength phase, I kind of like to think of the whole training cycle as one unit. And part of that is the relative length of the hypertrophy phase and the strength phase, and they're not mutually exclusive. So you kind of have to think of them as one. So if you guys have anything to add, feel free to jump in. If not, I'll go ahead and ask the next question. All right. So the next one is from Alex. I believe this is Zach's client, if I'm not mistaken. And he asks a very simple question. He asks, why does easy work?
Yeah, I thought this was a really, really interesting one. It kind of seems maybe a little bit simple on the surface, but I was thinking about this a little bit more. And it's a really good question, I think. I think it really gets down to the desire and often the impulse to say like more is better or training harder is always better, and kind of expecting better results from doing more, or always pushing farther in that direction. And I thought, so Alex been in a low fatigue strength phase recently, and he just kind of, he literally just had a squat yesterday where his SMO1RM shot up quite a bit, giving some unfavorable life kind of stress and stuff like that. So even in the amidst that, it still kind of saw a big shoot up in performance. So we've just kind of been talking about some of these ideas, and just like why quote unquote easier training works. And I think to me, it's just like one thing that I've always thought about is like, with training, we're chasing adaptations and not necessarily short-term gratification. I think that's probably going to make a post next week. Actually, that's a pretty good one. Yeah, no, I really think that's a good kind of way to think about it. I think the training that's going to establish those adaptations is definitely not always going to be the one that is going to make you feel like you're getting the most benefit acutely. So I think that impulse to push harder, that impulse to always say that more volume is better, training closer to failure is better. Multi-joint exercises are superior to single joint exercises because they're so hardcore, bro. Like all that stuff, I think probably comes from a good place to some degree, but I do think that some of it can be misplaced in the sense that at the end of the day, we need to supply a sufficient stimulus to have an adaptation, but that doesn't always kind of scratch that itch, that kind of that inner bro in us to really just go get it and really have one of those sessions where everything is really, really difficult. That's kind of where my head went with this kind of question. I don't know what you guys have to add on there.
I'll jump in quick and then Jake, I'll pass it to you. So I have two things I want to cover. The first is focusing your effort on the things that actually matter and the things that are most important, given where you're at in the training cycle. So again, I kind of mentioned this earlier in the podcast, is during a hypertrophy focus phase, you don't have to make your top set super hard and super grindy. But once you get to the work where you're actually making your money for that training cycle, that's where you kind of allocate your training resources towards. So just that shift in mindset can kind of make training in general seem a bit easier. And the second thing I'll say is as it pertains to short to moderate term strength, not to just kind of default to our low fatigue strength discussion. I think it is pretty important to conceptualize a multi-rep set. When you're thinking of a multi-rep set with a pretty heavy load, the most productive reps for strength are those first repetitions. And as you get to those later repetitions, let's say in a set of 5 at RP9, is there a benefit to grinding through some reps and getting that practice of training hard? Of course. You're also probably going to get a pretty good growth stimulus from that. But instead of grinding through those reps, what if we broke it into 2 triples or 2 doubles? Those are just things where, again, it kind of goes back to, is this harder than it needs to be? Like, are we actually getting a net positive compared to another option we have on the table? So that's just kind of an example that comes to mind. And then another just general example of why easy might work. I think of my client, Luke, who we just finished our first training block together, and he's working back from some glute symptoms, and his lower body training was like pretty dang easy. The peak intensity did not get very hard by the end of the training block. It might have gotten up to like a triple at a 6 or a 7. The back off work was even below RP6 sometimes, and the amount of work on competition squat and competition deadlift and close variance was very low, but it was predictable week to week. There's of course some fluctuations, but it's not like we buried ourselves one week and then the next week we have to take a ton of load off the bar to let our bodies catch up. So I guess that's all really to say is it adds to the predictability and just kind of slowly chipping away at these things, as opposed to that instant gratification of grinding through a single at 9 on every single lift every single week. So yeah, with that, have at it, Jake.
I think I only have a very small thing to add, which would be, I think sometimes it just kind of allows you to get out of your own way. I think people that, if chronically training to high RPEs, does it work? Sure. But like, if you have a bunch of other life stress that's now piled on top of that, all of a sudden it's not going to work nearly as well. So I think just having that, being able to back off and still have the confidence from the like scientific literature perspective showing us that it's still just as good, if not better, you can have the confidence that you can train quote unquote easy and still make all the same progress. And it just lets you kind of let off that release valve of stress in a way. So if you guys don't have anything else, I guess I'll throw out the last question and we'll run with that. So this is from my client, Matt. Shout out Matt of the now famous vertical row. Love his exercise selections. What has been your favorite moment of your lifting career? Zach, what do you got?
Yeah, I was trying to think about this. I think I'm gonna still have to go with the arbitrary bro 315 bench. I think like it sounds like simple and lighthearted, but like at the end of the day, like I've been doing this started lifting when I was like 15 or 16. Stupid, obviously, every single exercise I could think of in the gym to failure, 6 days a week. Still weighed like 140 pounds soaking wet, and it's just like coming from that perspective and like really, really struggling with bench press strength my entire life, and like genuinely thinking if I ever reached 275, I would like just like be so happy. And if I could tell my past self I'd be able to hit 315 and still be pretty confident with some room to go like for the rest of my life, I would be pretty stoked. So I mean, it's still like it's just an arbitrary number. It's just lifting weights, but we put a lot of time into this, and it's still fun, and it gives us something to push forward and just have some semblance of control in our lives and an aspect to continue progressing when we're all control freaks in this call. So having some semblance of something you can control day to day, I think is something that's pretty cool. So that's probably what I'm going to go with. Kick it over to you, Josh.
Yeah. So you would probably expect some answer like a 315 bench, very cliche, Zach, or a 400 squat or a 500 deadlift, something like that.
Hey, Josh, how much can you bench?
My answer is gonna show you, just how of gifted athletes all three of us are. So my answer is a 135 squat. So when I first started lifting weights, I could not even squat a 25 on each side, right? 95 pounds. And I had, the next semester, I had a strength and conditioning class, right? So we're going to be lifting weights in school, right? With females in your class. And I wasn't going to be able to put a 45-pound plate on the bar. So I worked my tail off with one goal of being able to put a 45-pound plate on the bar in time for the semester so that I could load that up in the strength and conditioning class. So that is probably my favorite moment of my lifting career, is being able to load up the big old 135 on the barbell in time for strength and conditioning sophomore year of high school.
That's awesome. I am the weak boy of this group, so I'm going to give you a little bit different perspective on mine. I did a bodybuilding prep last year that unfortunately got cut short due to the situation we are all still currently in. But there was a moment, my favorite moment, which ironically was also my lowest moment. There was a night where I couldn't sleep. My heart was racing. I literally thought I was going to die. Like, that's what it felt like. And I remember the next day, I texted my coach, shout out Ryan Dorse, and I was just like, dude, I got to talk to you. So he called me, and I'm literally sobbing on the phone talking to this dude. And he's helping me through. There's this moment in prep that I was at. I didn't know it at the time until he explained this to me, but there's this moment where you can't fight against it anymore. You have to just submit and accept that this is what it feels like. And it's like, you have to just feel like, if I die today, I die, whatever. Which sounds crazy, but you run out of steam to physically fight against it. You have to just put one foot in front of the other, right? So we call it stepping through the threshold. And that's where I was at, I reached my limit, and that was like me stepping through that door. And ever since that moment, like, I truly believe that I can do anything. It's the craziest feeling. So that is definitely my favorite moment. It was a life-changing moment, phone call. everything. So.
Well, that beats our answers, Josh. So
But I still can't bench to 15, so I'm still the worst one.
Well, I don't feel like I can do anything, Jake. So clearly, who's the winner here?
Well, apparently it doesn't work because I can't bench to 15.
But yeah, with that, Josh, we'll let you do your magic wrapping this one up.
All right. If you missed the memo at the beginning of the podcast and you still have not gone over to iTunes and hit 5 stars, it's actually super easy. People have always say like, just go leave us a rating and review. It really helps us out. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. I don't really do those types of things. Then I actually checked it out one time. Literally, you click on the podcast app and you just press 5 stars and it submits it. That's all you have to do. But honestly, if you don't do it, I also don't really mind. I kind of look forward to recording these, so we're going to continue to do them anyway. So honestly, do whatever you want to do.
I'm looking forward to some hate comments. So I'm really looking forward to that. So once we're big enough to get haters, that is really something I'm excited about. We can definitely do a segment on that once we get some hate comments.
This episode is going to be gone because we're not going to have paid the $15 a month so that this doesn't get deleted after 30 days of being on the air. So we're in the clear, man. All right. So if you have any questions, there is a Google form linked in the description of the YouTube description or the description of the podcast, and you can submit a question, and hopefully we'll get to it on the show. And thank you all for listening. Take care.